Hey guys. How you doing? Awesome. All right. Today I'm going to try and convince you that infectious disease is fantastic. No. So, while the title of my talk today is Social Behavior and Epidemics, what I really want to talk to you all about is actually a way of thinking about questions that make us passionate about research, and a way of thinking about science, but also more broadly a way of tackling the questions that we are passionate about answering in life. And so I think we've heard some amazing talks today from a lot of different disciplines trying to answer some beautiful questions. And instead of focusing on my question, which I love, and which I will try and convince all of you is just gorgeous, what I'd really like you to take home, even if you don't believe me that infectious diseases are fantastic, is that you will believe me that the important thing is to bring every perspective and aspect of your life into how you try and answer your question. And so I'm going to talk to you today about how I've brought into answering my questions of infectious disease a perspective from the natural world, from the theoretical world of mathematics, and from virtual worlds. And so I'll tell you a little bit about some very quick overview results from each of those without telling you really how I got there, and pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So, first of all, infectious diseases. Why do I love them? So this is one of these well-known images from the flu pandemic, 1918. Part of the reason I love them is that they are inherently social problems. These are infections that you pass from one person to another during daily contact. And it's one of the only aspects of society that I know about where both the risk comes from participating in society and the response, the way you mitigate that risk for yourself personally, is to continue participating in society by seeking medical care, by provisioning medical care to your loved ones. All of those things are involved in the same things that provide the risk itself. And so there's no way to tease apart an independent versus communal response. What this means is that we really have to understand the interplay between how people behave in response to these risks and how people perceive these risks, and how disease actually progresses through a population. And so I do this in many different ways, and the three most diverse that I'll talk to you about come from social insects, looking at and observing the patterns of social insects in the natural world, and trying to answer, well, social insects haven't been made extinct yet by evolutionary pressures of disease, so since that's true, they might be doing something that's protective about how their communities, which are very much like people's in the nature of disease risk, right? They're very highly related to each other, they come in constant contact with each other, they have to organize in order to achieve certain tasks. So their societies actually face quite the same types of infectious disease risks that we do. Maybe they're doing something right with that, and how can we understand it? And then looking at things purely theoretically from a mathematical construction and saying, well, okay, what's the impact of individual behavior on group level burden of disease? How much does what I do change what will happen to all of you guys the next time that flu season is really peaking? And then looking into the virtual worlds of online multiplayer games to try and see, well, how does what the rest of the crowd is doing, or what the government is saying, or how people are observing risk, how does that impact what their behavior will be in a risky situation? So one of the beautiful things I love are dampwood termites. They are fantastic creatures. They are much better at public health than we are. They actually make public health announcements to their colonies, and then everyone follows the public health advice that's given. I know, if we could do this, we would be so on top of things. But so one of the beautiful insights that we were able to gain by looking at these dampwood termites, and also looking at honeybee colonies and ant colonies and colonies of eusocial wasps and some solitary bees and some solitary wasps, is that actually by looking at that theoretically across these biological taxa, we can predict from knowing their physiological susceptibility to infectious disease, and from knowing something about how they organize, we can match disease risk with social organization in order to make it most effective in terms of the colony's production and most effective in terms of defense against societal risk of infectious disease. So that was an amazing thing when we were actually able to line it up and go, okay, honeybees, clearly, they have those disease risks, they should really do that. Oh, they do that. Okay, that's awesome. And in fact, ants don't do that. Well, ants have this other disease, ants have this other disease risk. That works. So looking across those, we were able to gain insight, and we're now trying to translate that into now how will we abstract that and learn from that when we prepare as human populations for pandemics. So one of the things that I look at is seasonal workforce depletion from malaria. And how do you make sure that your agricultural harvesting doesn't have exactly your entire workforce sick right when your crops need to be harvested? Turns out termites have the answer. So one of the things I do is talk to governments about what termites would do to prevent pandemic flu. Yes, and then there's math. Don't worry about what any of this means. It's really just meant to make sure that everyone in the audience knows that those really meaningless algebraic expressions you were forced to do in high school, if not afterwards, get used. So seriously, we do. Math is beautiful, and math can be useful. And don't worry, I guess, about what these mean, although if you'd like, there's a paper that explains it. But here's an example of what these characterize. So we talked a little about math as the theoretical world. Well, how much does the individual action lead to a group outcome of disease burden and also of efficiency in organizing a society? Well, here's a simulation that my lab coded. And so you can see as we start the simulation, oh, it works. This red line that you're seeing across the screen is the global definition of how well society is organizing. And we're about to throw some disease into it. And each of these guys, each of these dots is making or breaking friendships depending on their own social preferences. And what we're seeing is that they're actually doing better, doing this not with the idea of society in mind, just with their own selfish ideals in mind of who their friends should be. They're actually increasing the organizational success of their population. And you can see that that's actually having an impact. These orange and purple and blue curves here have to do with the epidemic spreading through the network. And which colors they're turning over time has to do with whether or not they're infected by contact with their friends. And so while I'm only showing you this one animation, we can do this for different types of individual behaviors, and we can get different epidemiological outcomes, different understandings of the patterns of disease and the global burden of disease in that population. Okay, so what we were able to get from things like that. So first of all, the types of choices matter. So whether or not you want to make and break social contacts based on an idea of continued family, or an idea of, well, maybe you'll go shopping every day in the same place, or maybe you'll go shopping every day in different places and meet different people and try different things. Those change the societal level of disease burden. And even more importantly, we discovered that the continued dynamics matter. So when I was showing you that red line of how successfully the population is organized, I can give you a rigorous mathematical description of the global population. And there are lots of different networks of contact that could create that description. And it was usually thought that if we had that global description correct, that we would then be able to describe the disease burden accurately from that global description, because the description doesn't change even if the particular friendships changed, because the total description would remain constant. And it turns out that's not true. It turns out that even if you keep the total description constant, the ongoing infection process and the ongoing process of making and breaking friendships, even if they don't change the global description, can drastically impact the nature of disease. And then we get to, okay, we've been through the natural world, and now we've been through the theoretical world to gain some insight. How do people make choices in the face of risk? And here's where what if doesn't do well. What if is a great question, but people are bad at predicting their own what if when it comes to emotional reactions in response to risk. And we've tried asking people, what would you do if, and then waiting for something bad to happen and seeing if they do that. And we don't. We all suck at this. So instead of trying to tackle these questions hypothetically, we've actually started looking in virtual worlds. And here are two of the virtual worlds in which we've looked. One is World of Warcraft. It's kind of a dark picture. How many World of Warcraft players? How many World of Warcraft players who don't admit to it in public? Okay, at least two of us. And this is Yville. This is a social online virtual world for teens. And they both have diseases that we're studying, and looking at the reactions of the population to how those risks are presented and how the social construction of risk affects the behavior in response to it. There was a beautiful accidental epidemic in World of Warcraft called corrupted blood, where people started exploding in little clouds of blood and dropping in dead skeletons. And it was really actually very good for panicking the player base, even though death is not really a big deal. Isn't that awesome? Okay, so what did we see in virtual worlds? Well, first of all, importantly, we did actually see all of the social behaviors we'd expect in a real-world epidemic. But it's not that the case that we're using this in order to say what will actually happen. What we're doing is mining it for inspiration about the sorts of things we should consider in the real world. And already there are two of those from looking in virtual worlds that we hadn't thought of as epidemiological modelers before we looked at the behavior in the virtual space. And those are empathy and curiosity. Things that do motivate people during risky scenarios, but that we hadn't been including in our epidemiological models until then. So in the last few moments that I've got to talk to you, what I want to drive home is that my lab's work is to look everywhere for inspiration and insight into our system, and to look in every facet of our own lives, not just coming into work and saying, okay, today what will I do? But the World of Warcraft work came because we play World of Warcraft and something cool came up. And the perspectives of all of these people, these are the very cool people in my lab who do half of the work I talk about as though it's mine. And these are the people who raised me in an academic sense on top, my academic mentor and my parents and siblings and spouse. And when I talk to them about my research, they all force different perspectives from me. And so they are very much a living part of what I do. And so on a closing note, I'd encourage all of you, and no matter what is driving you and about what you're passionate, to bring every aspect of your life into it. So thank you very much.